Welcome back to Trench Talk for your weekly dose of underground metal. I am, of course, your host, Flight of Icarus from metaltrenches.com. Please like, subscribe, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Vero, Twitter. Check out our Patreon so that you can continue to support what we're doing here and help the channel grow. And, of course, check out metaltrenches.com for daily metal reviews, streams, music videos, what have you. We also have an email list you can subscribe to. There's a link to that in every post down at the bottom. You can find helpful links there to other various things I've just talked about as well. And as I'm talking today too, you will find links down in the description for all of the bands and topics that we discuss today. So just getting right into it, we're going to talk about an album inspired by the literal death and burial rituals of cultures around the world. This is melodic death and black metal project Death Karma, returning with part 2 of the aptly named The History of Death and Burial Rituals. This is another project started by Slovakia-based musician Vladimir Pavelka, also known as Infernal Vlad. He was already popular for his work on cult black metal band Cult of Fire, which already showed his interests in other regions and cultures, with him linking in a lot of Middle Eastern sounding influences, both with local instruments, using things like sitar, and as well as borrowing imagery from those areas with the likes of Kali and other Hindu goddesses showing up in the artwork and on album covers. But he has taken it to the next level with Death Karma, which is literally all about the various interesting ways that countries around the world are disposing of and honoring at the same time their dead. This is a band for fans of things like, again, Cult of Fire. If you're familiar with that project, there's a lot of similarities between their sounds. Also Shamash and Migla. MGLA. I absolutely loved part 1 of this series. It was definitely one of my favorite albums, if not my favorite album of 2015, from the music right down to the packaging. And once again, I am completely enchanted just a few seconds into this release. This is a very kind of independent project. They're getting help from Beyond Eyes Productions, especially in terms of distribution, but largely this is something that will just pop up when it's ready to pop up. There were no announcements of a new album, as far as I knew, until maybe a month ago, and we got a dose of the album art, and we're just told that, hey, this is dropping really soon, get ready. And man, I was amped. Because, again, I remembered how good the first one was. I marked my calendar immediately. I went to see if there was a Bandcamp I could wish list, so I would get the email notification right away. Sure enough, on the 26th, this thing dropped in digital format, and I started listening and was not disappointed one bit. From the opening tribal drumming to the atmospheric guitars, we're not in Kansas anymore, and first stop is Haiti with promises of voodoo rituals. On this track, we've got ritualistic chanted vocals, lots of hand drums that are just taking me far, far away from where I sit right now recording this. I was reminded while I was listening of the Netflix series Morbid Tourism, if I'm getting that name right, but it's about morbid tourism, and it just follows this guy from New Zealand who follows tourist locations, and there is an episode on voodoo where he visits a voodoo priestess and is like involved in an actual ritual, and then meets with like ex-Colombian drug lords and things of that nature. And listening to this album, I feel like is a similar experience to watching something like that, because you're sort of just immersing yourself in a very different culture and from a very death-oriented standpoint, as shouldn't be a surprise. Great thing is you don't even have to buy a plane ticket or even leave the house. You can just throw this bad boy on and get taken away. It's a real journey. Next stop, we've got Tibet for a sky burial. I had to look this up. Quoting Wikipedia here, a funeral practice in which a human corpse is placed on a mountaintop to decompose while exposed to the elements or to be eaten by scavenging animals. So apparently in Tibet, because they're above the tree line, the ground is very rocky. It's really too hard to dig into to actually bury a body. And then also there's no easy access to wood for cremation, which is what a lot of the rest of the region uses. They are left to come up with other options, and so they're literally just hanging these corpses out to be picked clean by carrion birds and what have you. Again, another very morbid image, but one that absolutely fascinates me. And I have to say about this whole album, it's just so inspiring how Vladimir manages to capture the essence of each country with such humble reverence. It's not contrived or schlocky. It doesn't feel like this is some kind of dark, ugly imagery, so I'm going to capitalize on that. No, there's this very genuine respect and sense of wonder coming out of all these songs. Furthermore, in many cases, I can recognize the current destination that we're at within just a few seconds of the track starting. There were multiple times where this happened. I wasn't looking at the track listing, but just hearing the melodies and sometimes even the extra instrumentation that was coming in, I could tell where we were. And this was particularly true when Scandinavia came on. These are undeniable sounds that we know and love from that Viking style and Nordic lore. This is probably the most traditional sounding track within the genre, given that there are obvious foundations in black metal with the likes of Bathory that kind of forged the way for Viking metal as well. Regardless, this is a very impressive and enjoyable track, and among my favorites. I especially love the pace transition that happens a little bit later on in the track. It's one of those moments where it happens and you just get this big grin on your face. And it ultimately ends up being one of, if not my favorite moment on the album. But perhaps the most interesting track for me was New Zealand Mongrel Mob. Not only is this just a great track, I ended up learning something, just like how I had to look up the Sky Burial. This track really intrigued me because it's got these sounds of motorcycles revving their engines recurring throughout, to the point where I could almost see and smell these black fumes. And I ended up looking up New Zealand motorcycle burial rituals or something along those search terms, and ended up learning about the burial of Hell's Angels leader Shane Bullock, which is what this track is, I believe, in reference to. So in this way, the album feels like an immersive sociology lesson just as much as an impressive album. I absolutely love it. I actually said in my review, I feel like I learned and experienced more listening to this album than I did in all of my collective sociology courses that I took in college. This is definitely the most kind of pure second wave influence sounding track. A lot of mayhem vibes in the very aggressive, rebellious tone. Another track rich with historical imagery and that was instantly recognizable without looking at the track list was Egypt, Pharaohs. I listen to this track and I can picture boats drifting on the Nile and slaves constructing pyramids under the hot sun and feel that hot sand under my feet. And again, this is just such a journey listening to all of these tracks one after another. I really haven't felt this inspired by history and geography probably since I used to read like kids' National Geographic in like grade school and learning about dinosaurs and, you know, people in other countries that had very different practices than my own, and just being so taken by that idea that there were more ways to live than just the way that I was living in the suburbs. Honestly, I could go on and on with this one. Every track has its own interesting flavor. Ultimately, I found myself reflecting on a lot of the BS around people who are supposedly all outraged by cultural appropriation, and you've got these hipsters kind of virtue signaling and feigning their frustration over it, and it all just seems like a show. And the thing that I don't like about it is, to me, somebody who is interested in wearing clothes from another culture or playing music from another culture, using the language or even an accent from another culture, is interested and excited by that thing. In most cases, you start making too many rules about who can do and say and play and whatever these different things, and you start to lose things like amazing acting performances where somebody was able to embody the complete personality right down to the accent of somebody who is from a different part of the world than them, who clearly has great respect for them, and potentially in this case too, not being able to play music and instruments that come from other cultures. And to me, that's just ridiculous. Where do you draw the line? Also, have you ever told somebody that they can't do something? What's the usual reaction to that? Have you even met a person before? So, all that to say that I think it's great that we've got people, great artists especially out there like Vlad, who are exploring these different sounds and ideas and getting people excited not only about music but also about other cultures, especially in this very dark and morbid, fascinating kind of way. Now, while this is a near perfect album, it's not exactly a 10 out of 10. In particular, I was kind of less impressed by the track Indonesia, Tanah Toraja, which I'm probably horribly mispronouncing. There are some moments throughout the album that are a little bit repetitious and would have been worth some trimming, but in response to a common criticism of the first album that there was kind of loudness wars, production issues there, it was over amplified and kind of crunchy sounding. I felt like this one has a more dynamic sound. It doesn't have as much of that issue. It feels like there's a lot more room for these tracks to breathe, which is great because you're not missing a single note and there's just so much to take in and appreciate. Also, kind of a criticism, physical copies are not cheap. You can get the digital for just a little over $7, which is pretty fair. But the CD copies, I ended up paying, after shipping and the conversion rate, $26.99. And again, that's just for the CD, that's not for a record. But in their defense, I will say when it comes to Vladimir's projects, you're always getting a quality product. Their albums come in digipacks usually, and they're covered in just absolutely gorgeous artwork, very fitting of the themes of the album. They're also fully laminated, and they just feel good in your hand, and they're always nice to take off the shelf. They're among my favorite albums to kind of just, as I'm walking by my CD rack, take off and take a look at every now and then. So more than I would generally like to spend. I try to keep my cap for a CD just around $15, sometimes $20 if it is kind of more difficult to obtain. So this is definitely even higher than that, but I ended up biting the bullet just because I love and want to support this band. Favorite tracks? Probably Scandinavia, Ship Burial, Egypt, Pharaohs, and Haiti, Voodoo. Although really pretty much every track on here is a winner. For scores, I gave it a 10 for enjoyability. I'm planning on listening to this thing many, many times over and over. Give it a 10 for musicianship because even though it's not super technical, it's very diverse, it's layered. There's a lot of different things happening with melodies and instrumentation, and I really love the drumming as well. And then I gave it a 9 for innovation because it's a pretty unique concept. Also stepped up the game, maybe even a little bit from the last one. Not a ton of black metal bands doing exactly what Death Karma is doing here. Definitely some similar ones, but I would put Death Karma at the top of the pack for this particular style. And yeah, another 9.7, very close to a 10 out of 10. I'm going to have to bump something from my top 10 lists because this is just going to have to be included on there. Moving to shoutouts. First off, we've got Dysmorphic with An Elusive Progress. This is some more top-shelf technical progressive death metal out of France, this time via Unique Leader Records. Insanely consistent album. Each track is just around 4 to 5 minutes for a total runtime of a really lean, mean 45. Feels just right. It really seems like Dysmorphic have really honed in on kind of their sweet spot in terms of how much space do their compositions actually need, and let's not cut them down too much, and also let's not stretch them on needlessly forever. I will say I have some critiques that there's not really like an obvious trademark, and that's kind of a detriment. I have a concern that people are going to kind of forget about this album because it doesn't necessarily stand out amongst other progressive technical death metal bands. There's so many that kind of have this same style, particularly things like Necrophagus, The Ritual Aura, Obscura. It would be easy for this to get lost in the muddle, so definitely check these guys out, and if you like it, pick it up and add them to your watch list because they do a damn good job. Next, we've got Jesus Peace with Only Self. This is another punishing, uncompromising, metallic hardcore band from Pennsylvania with the album coming out via Southern Lord, or it's already out, I should say. Once again, it seems like the last 2 years or so have really been just sort of the new era of metallic hardcore. So many bands coming out in this style, definitely similar in vein to Harm's Way, Vane, Code Orange, etc. I'm going to be interested to see how these bands sort of battle it out, and I really hope that encourages them to sort of branch out in different directions so that it doesn't get too crowded with all of them having sort of the same sound. And then last but not least, we've got Mantar with The Modern Art of Setting Ablaze. Mantar is a German sludge, blackened punk kind of duo, now out via Nuclear Blast. The riffs are kind of a mixture of rock, sludge, and punk with some black metal tinge to the vocals. This very wretched, ugly style. Very rock and roll, but with a sort of swampy, evil vibe latched onto it. I saw them live with Cobalt, and watching them on stage, just these two guys, one drummer and the other one a guitarist vocalist, it was like traveling back in time to the 90s and seeing something like Helmet play on stage, just that same sweaty, shirtless, really great. So much attitude, excellent album, and again, I'd encourage you to check them out live as well if you're a fan of things like High on Fire, Red Fang, and Deathrite, but again, with a bit more kind of black metal infusion to the overall sound. And I think that will do it for today. Thanks as always for listening. And again, be sure to like, subscribe, follow, check out our Patreon, check out the website, get on the mailing list so that you do not miss anything, and spread the word so that more and more people can listen to this and hear about these excellent bands, and they can make sales and let the record companies know that there is a demand for these groups and they need to support them in continuing to make this awesome music. So, until next week, I will see you next time.